All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking. We have many sponsors for today's share to thank all of them, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul. Shindin Avram Kalman in honor of Yechiel's engagement to Alana Falik and in memory of their parents, Jerome and Bernice Kalman and Alexandra and Frederica David. To thank Barak, Maya, and Sandy Hoffman, Dora Limbos, and Avi Malamid for dedicating the shiur in this month in memory of Reuven ben Emmanuel Zichron Livracha. To thank Ayala and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating the shiur this month in the Susava Refuah Shalema for Shulamis Bas Susha. The Daf Yomi shiur in the Susava Refuah Shalema for Yehuda ben Michal. Our week of learning sponsors, Louis Goldberg, thanking Hashem for the engagement of his grandson Eli Bogart to Rivi Galaskov, daughter of Steve Galaskov, Mazel Tov. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Joseph and Ellen Miller, Iris and Ed Miller and family, Leslie and Adam Rosen and family, Lezecher Nishmas Richard Berman. May the learning Emerit Hashem provide an aliyah for his neshama. To thank our day of learning sponsors, Ariel and Rachel Osipov in the Schus of Refuah Shlema for Irina Bas Brilliant, who is undergoing surgery this morning. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, she will have a complete and enduring refuah. With that, let us begin. So a lot to do today, a really, truly beautiful daf ahead of us this morning. We are picking up, today's daf is Ayin Beis 72. And we are picking up on Ayin Aleph Amud Beis 71b. If you see, there's a Mishnah. If you look, there's Tosas Kigon. If you go right across, there's a Mishnah. And we are picking up 2, 4, 6, 7 lines up from the Mishnah at the 2 dots. So remember again, the Mishnah was talking about the wife makes a neder, right? The way we understood now the Mishnah is the wife makes a neder not to put on perfume, and the husband confirms that neder, or I should say affirms that neder. Rabbi Yossi says if she's a poor woman, if the neder is just ongoing, then ultimately again he has to divorce her and give her a ksuva. Says the Gemara, "V'kama kitzva." How much is the kitzva? In other words, that the Gemara is asking is like this: for what duration is acceptable? In other words, what is the maximum duration that if she can make the neder without triggering the need for get and ksuva? To which the Gemara says, "Yud beis chodesh, 12 months." Rabbi Rachana Amar Yochanan Eser Shanim, 10 years. Rav Chisda Amar Avimi Regel. No, the maximum is a regel. Why? Shekein ben Osisa miskashtos beregel, because it was customary again for the Jewish women to go ahead and put perfume on in honor of the regalim. Okay, uba'ashiros lamid yom. But the Mishnah said, however, if she's a wealthy woman, the maximum duration of the neder is 30 days. So ma'ishna lamid yom. Why 30 days? Amar Abaye shekein isha chashuva nanis mereach kshuta lamid yom. Because we'll say it was the derech, it was the way of an isha chashuva, of an important woman to go ahead and perfume herself once every 30 days. Incredible. I will say now we come to a dramatically amazing Mishnah. Here we go. Hamadir's ishtush letelech lebeis aviyah. So we'll say if a man makes a neder upon his wife, prohibiting her from going ahead and going to her father's home. So this is the neder he makes, right? This is the neder he makes. Bizman shu ima be'ir chodesh. So we'll say, so once again, the topic, the theme is the same, which is what's the maximum amount of time that you could go ahead and impose these type of nedarim without triggering the need for divorce and ksuva. So the Gemara says a man goes and makes a neder, ultimately what? That his wife can't go to her father's home. So the Mishnah says, Bizman shu ima be'ir, if the father and daughter live in the same city, ultimately the Mishnah says, chodesh echad yikayim, shnayim yotzi v'yitin ksuva. If the neder is for a duration of a month, fine. If it's for more than a month, ultimately it triggers the need for get and ksuva. Ubizman shu be'ir acher. So if the father lives in a different city, regel echad yikayim shloshi yotzi. Ultimately, again, if it's for one regel, fine, the marriage could continue. But for 3, if it's 3 months, the neder is for 3 months, he has to divorce her and give her ksuva. Okay, we'll talk more about that case in the Gemara. Hamadir's ishtosh letelech lebeis ha'evel, or lebeis ha'avel, or lebeis ha'mishnah. Let's say a man makes a neder prohibiting his wife from going to a shiva house, a Beis HaAvel, or by the Krosimina Levaya, or the Beis HaMishnah, or to a wedding celebration, Yotzi v'yitin ksuva. Ultimately, again, he has to divorce her and immediately pay her a ksuva. Why? Because he is closing the door in front of her. Okay, like I said, we'll see with the Gemara exactly what this means. But if he said, no, I'm making this neder prohibiting you from going to the Shiva home, or the Levaya, or the wedding celebration because of something else. In other words, he's saying, I have a reason why I don't want you to do this, Rashai. Then ultimately, again, he is permitted to make this neder. Amrla almanas shetomri leploni masha amartali. Husband says that he's requiring her, right? Almanas literally means a condition, right? The condition, which sounds like he's saying that if you don't go ahead and I'll remain married to you on the condition that you tell so-and-so something specific. So go tell so-and-so what she told me. O masha amarti lach, or go tell so-and-so what I told you. O shetei memale umare la'ashpa. Or if he tells her to fill up and to pour out into the garbage. Well, again, we'll see what that case means. Yotzi v'yitin ksuva. In all of these cases, he has to divorce her and give her ksuva. Again, what exactly those cases are, we'll discuss. Says the Gemara, Haguf Akasha. So we'll say, let's focus on the first case in the Mishnah, where the husband's making the neder, precluding ultimately again his wife from going to her father's home. So the Gemara says as follows: So Haguf Akasha, Amrit Regal Echad Yikayim Hashnayim Yotzi. So I will say, the first part of the Mishnah said, if you made a neder for 1 month, okay, the marriage could endure. If the neder is for 2 months, triggers ultimately again the need for divorce and ksuva. Right? Echad Yikayim Hashnayim Yotzi v'yitin ksuva. Here's the problem. The second case of the Mishnah is Shlosha Yotzi v'yitin ksuva. In the second case of the Mishnah, it said, this is where the father doesn't live in the same town. It says a maximum of, if it's for 1 month, I'm sorry? Sorry? So Amos Sefer, Shlosha Yotzi v'yitin ksuva, Hashnai Mikayim. Ultimately, again, in the second part of the Mishnah, ultimately, again, it says that halacha l'maisa, it says 3, right? It says 3, Sheva 3, Yotzi v'yitin ksuva, Hashnai Mikayim. But ultimately, again, for 2, he could go ahead and maintain her as a wife. So which one is it? In other words, the cash is on 2. So I'm Abaye, Seifa son lekohanes. No. The Seifa is talking about a kohanes. Rabbi said this goes back to last sugya, because in last sugya we spoke about the idea that we give in these type of nidarim situations, we give a kohanic family a bit more time to work things out. Why? Because again, in the event of divorce, can't go ahead and remarry her. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Huda, Seifa son the Kohenes, Rabbi Hudahi, and both say this is Rabbi Huda's sheet in the previous sugya, that we give a Kohenes, ultimately again a longer duration to go ahead and work this through. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Ula Amar Lo Kasha Kan Beredufa, Kan B'Shein Redufa. Shabbos says very interesting. He says that halacha l'maisa is talking about 2 different women. One is talking about a woman who often goes to her father's home. If you look at Rashi says redufa, leilech lebeis avia tamid, shnayim yotzi, she'ena redufa, shnayim yekayim. Or I should say differently. Leilech lebeis avia tamid, shnayim yotzi, she'ena redufa, shnayim yekayim. So we'll say, interesting enough, Rabbi Bar Ula says, it also depends on the frequency in which she goes to her father's home. So one is talking about a woman who goes to her father's home quite frequently, and one is talking about the case of where she goes to her father's home more infrequently. Good. So we'll say the Gemara just throws in a little bit of adds in a little bit of agarata over here, talking about the dynamic of a girl going to her father's home. As hayisi be'enav kimoses shalom. So we'll say the Gemara quotes over here, the pasuk in Shir Hashirim, that then I will be in his eyes as one who finds peace. So Rabbi Yochanan kekala, Shenim says Shlema bebeis chameha or redufa lelech lahagid shvacha beis avia. So we'll say the pasuk is describing so beautifully a kala who is beloved even in the eyes of her in-laws, and she runs home to tell her own parents that she has found favor in the eyes of her in-laws. Bayaba yamahu numashim tikri ishi velo tikri li od bali. So we'll say another beautiful pasuk from Hosea. It will be on that day that we will be called ishi V'lo tikri od Bali. I will call Hashem Ishi, my husband, and not Bali. Now, both say Ishi and Bali both go ahead and translate as husband. But Ishi, Rashi points out over here, is Lashon Ishus v'nisuin, is a closer Lashon. Is a closer Lashon than Baal. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan, Kikala bebeis chameha, v'lo kikala bebeis aviha. That ultimately the relationship with Klal Yisrael between Hashem will be like a kala in her father-in-law's home and not a kala in her father's home. We'll say, what's the distinction? So remember again, a kala lives in her father's home during Erusin. Right? She lives in her father-in-law's home after Nisuin. So the Gemara is describing it was customary for a couple often to live with the in-laws after they first got married. So we'll say, in other words, with the husband's parents after they first got married. So we'll say, I'd say something beautiful. So the Gemara says, which is such a beautiful dynamic, that I'll be by Yomahu, right, on that day that day often refers to Messianic redemption. The relationship with Hashem will change from one ultimately again of a kala living in her father's home, separate from her husband, ultimately again to a kala living in her father-in-law's home, together with her husband. Beautiful. Hamadir Sishto. So I'll say, so remember again, the next case in the Mishnah was that halacha lamaisa, if a man made a neder prohibiting his wife from going to a house of mourning, a beis avel, a levaya, and a beis hamishta, a wedding celebration. So says the Gemara, bishlama. So I'll say, so remember again, in that case, the Mishnah says that triggers divorce and ksuva, unless of course what? He says, mipnei davar acher. In other words, the husband has a reason for doing so. So what's the pshat? Bishlam lebeis hamishter. I understand, ultimately, again, the Bible says incredible Gemara. I understand why, if a husband makes a neder prohibiting his wife from going to a wedding celebration, that triggers the need for immediate divorce and ksuva. Why? The Gemara says, it's a mishlam lebeis hamishter, ika, top of ayin beis, ika, noel bifaneh. Because Rabbi said, listen to this, he's closing the door in front of her. And Rabbi said, this is such an interesting thing. So going ahead and prohibiting one's wife from attending a wedding celebration is such a severe thing that it triggers the need for divorce and ksuba, getting ksuba. Why? The Gemara says, Noel bifana, he's closing the door in front of her. What door is he closing? Look at the top Rashi, Ayin Beis and Aleph. Deles shel simcha upikuach tsar. So Rabbi say, what is he closing off to her? Because going to a wedding is a form of celebration. A person gets to celebrate. But I will say this lashon over here, pikuach tsar. What does pikuach tsar mean? Pikuach tsar means the removal of difficulty. See, Rabbi say is fascinating. There are two things that happen when you go to a simcha. Number one, you could enjoy. And number two, what else can happen? You forget your problems. At least for a little bit of time. At least for a little bit of time, you forget your problems. I will say, it's such an incredible yesod. See, there's these two dimensions to simcha. There's the ability to feel a sense of joy, and then there's the ability to be somewhere where you could forget about your own stuff for just a little bit of time. And that is such a necessary thing in life. The ability to enjoy life, but at the same time, the ability to forget about the difficulties just for a little bit. So a husband says to his wife that you cannot attend the chasana, you can't attend simchas. Ultimately, he's depriving her of that basic need. And that deprivation of that basic need makes the marriage unsustainable. Incredible. Rabbi say, what's the problem with preventing her from going to a shiva house or going to a levaya, right? In other words, I got it. It might not be like a normal thing to make your wife make an edron, but lamaisa, why does that cause dissolution of the marriage? To which the Gemara says, Tana, because here's the problem. L'machar himesa ve'en kol beria sopta. So what's going to be the problem? Tomorrow, let's say tomorrow if the wife dies, no one is going to come to eulogize her. V'ige da'amri ein kol beria sofna. Or others say that ultimately she's going to die tomorrow and no one's going to bury her. The Gemara says, listen to this. The Gemara says very simple. Tanya hayre meir omer. What does this mean? Mai dichsiv tov leleches al beis evel mileches lel beis mishteh. Basher Husof Kala Adam B'Chayitin Elibo. We both say perhaps one of the most profound psukim in all of Tanakh. It is better to go to a house of mourning than it is to go to a house of celebration. For this is the end of all man, and the living will take it to heart. Mai B'Chayitin Elibo. So we'll say, what does it mean that the living will take it to heart? So we'll say, by the way, what's Pasha Pshat? What's Pasha Pshat? Pasha Pshat is that we go through life thinking that life is an infinite renewable resource. And so there's no urgency to accomplish, right? We kick the proverbial can down the road all of the time. So we'll say there is no greater musar to show us that that is incorrect than going to a levaya. A levaya is a stark reminder that life is a finite, non-renewable resource. And the end comes for all. So if there's something you have to accomplish it. I always say, if you want to know, I think, the greatest musar that exists in this world, it's not words. It's not words. You know what it is? It's a sound. And what's the sound? The greatest sound that awakens every single heart? It's the sound of the first shovelful of earth hitting the aron, hitting the casket. That's the sound. That's the sound of finitude, right? That is the sound of finiteness. That is the sound, I will say, that it's over, right? When you hear that, it's like lahavdil, like, right, when there's a race, like they shoot the gun, like that's the beginning. That sound of that first shovelful of earth hitting the aron, it's done. It's done. It's done. There's no do-overs, there's no this. And that sound comes for every single person. I don't say this in a morose way, I will say, because death is a part of life. But I say it in a way that, like, we live just sometimes without an urgency, without an intensity. I like to be laid back. No one should be laid back. There's so much to accomplish, and there's so little time to accomplish it. And we don't even know how much time we have in this earth. So Shlomo Melech says, go to the levaya. Go. V'hachai yitein alibo. But the Gemara gives a different pshat. The Gemara says, what does it mean, v'hachai yitein alibo? Tvarim shal misa. It means, it teaches us, chai yitein alibo, take to heart aspects of death. Tesape yispadune, to teach us, if you eulogize others, people will eulogize you. Tekavar yikbarune, if you bury others, people will bury you. The yodel yidlune, if you help to carry the aron of other people, they will actually. Rashi says over here, the yodel means not to lift with your body, but rather to lift your voice. If you cry over others, others will cry over you. Telavai yilavune, if you go ahead and you go to the lavai, you accompany the dead. Accompany the aron, right? Go follow the aron. Others will follow you. Detan yitanune. If you go ahead and you carry the casket, others will carry you. So I will say. So the point the Gemara is making over here is there is a utilitarian aspect to going ahead and attending a levaya, which is if you attend the levayas of others, then what? When it's your time, others will come to help out at your levaya. So therefore, again, coming full circle, if a husband makes a neder prohibiting his wife from going to the levaya, she says to him, you're cutting me off from making sure that there's someone to look after me when I'm dead, when I die, and my levaya needs to be attended to. In other words, which is an incredible yesod. If you do not go ahead and help out others in their time of need, there will not be others to help your family out in your time of need. So that's why, again, if he goes ahead and makes this neder, preventing him from going to the levaya, grounds for divorce and a ksuva. Incredible. However, if the husband says, no, I'm making this neder, I have a reason for it. So ultimately, again, then they don't have to get divorced. So the Gemara says, "My davra acher." What does that mean? Like, what's the davra acher that you're referring to? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel mishum bnei adam prutzim shemetzuyin sham. Ultimately, what? I will say, because of immoral people who are going to be at these places. Amar Ravashi, lo amran de ela. So I will say. So the point over here is, he says to her, "I don't want you going to these places." Now I will say, here's what's interesting. What's interesting is that I understand that maybe by a wedding celebration, sometimes there are people who act inappropriately. So apparently even by a levaya, right? There could be people ultimately, again, who act inappropriately as well. So if he says, I don't want you going to these places because there are immoral people, then fine. The Gemara says, however, Amar Ravashi, lo Amar El Chazik. This is only true if you know with certainty that these immoral people frequent these events. Avalois chazek lo kol kamine. But I will say ultimately, again, if it's not established that these inappropriate people will be there, he doesn't have a right to restrict her mobility to attend these occasions. So I will say, so remember again, next case in the Mishnah, he says to her, right, we're going to remain married on the condition that you go ahead and tell so and so what I told you, or tell so and so what you told me. So if right, the Gemara says v'tema, let her just go. Let her say it. What's the big deal? Just tell over whatever she's being asked to tell. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Devarim shel Kalon. We're talking about matters of degradation. I will say the idea over here is he's telling her to disclose certain intimate details, either that she told him or that he told her. And a woman is not obligated to debase herself like that in order to maintain her marriage. Therefore, if this is the kind of marriage, this is the kind of guy, Chazal said, divorce her, give her ksuba. So Shabbos says, remember again, last case of the Mishnah was, husband tells the wife to go ahead and fill up and pour out into the garbage dump. So the Gemara says, okay, it sounds strange, but viti avid. So let her just do it. In other words, again, it sounds strange, but if that's what's necessary, why cause the dissolution of the marriage over this? To which the Gemara says, no. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel, shetemali vinofetzes. I will say it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor. What he's telling her is that after the act of relations, I want you to do whatever you have to do not to become pregnant. That's the metaphor for filling up and then pouring out. So what he's telling her is, look, I don't want to have kids. I don't want to have kids, right? So Lamaisa, after the act of relations, again, we've seen this again, lifting up, like whatever it is, right? Ultimately, again, do what you have to do not to become pregnant. So Masnisa Tana, Shetemali Asare Kademayim, Vetiara La Ashba. So we'll say in the Brisa, we learned that she should fill up 10 pitchers of water and ultimately pour it out. According to Shmuel, I understand ultimately why he has to divorce her. But according to Irose, if it's literal, fill up 10 pitchers of water and pour it out. So let her, as strange as it sounds, just do it and maintain the marriage. Ultimately, I will say, because she looks like a shote. It just looks like foolish behavior. And if a husband does something, ultimately, to make his wife feel or appear foolish, ultimately, I will say this, by the way, is also such an incredible musar, that even sometimes, couples joke around, and it's so important to be careful about making jokes at your wife's expense, because sometimes a husband unwittingly makes his wife appear foolish, right? And again, sometimes a husband has a thicker skin than the wife does. Have to be very careful with that. We already seen Gemara how careful a husband has to be with the feelings of his wife. So the point over here is we have two things happening. One opinion, Shmuel holds that this whole idea of filling up and pouring out is a metaphor for the husband going in and telling his wife, I don't want you to become pregnant. Look at Rashi. It's the first short line in Rashi. La'achar tashmish, v'mali rachma shichvas zera. So he tells her after the act of relations, right, move your legs around, jump up and down, so that ultimately, again, the zera will not take root and you won't become pregnant. The Brisa seems to indicate that halacha lamaisa, no, he's asking her to engage in foolish behavior. So he's asking her to make herself look like a fool in order to maintain the marriage. Either way, the Gemara says not acceptable. So the Gemara says, Amrav Kana Hamadir Ishto Shlotisha. So we'll say, by the way, I'll just point out, this, what's interesting about this is as follows. Even though a woman is not obligated in period of a review, we just saw this before, right? A woman is not obligated to have children. So if the husband says, listen, I don't want to have kids. After we have relations, I'm asking you to do whatever you have to do not to become pregnant. Shabbos say, even though she doesn't have a mitzvah period of review, having children is a natural actualization of her internal maternal instinct. That's number one. Number two, having children has a utilitarian benefit, namely that I have someone to take care of me, hopefully when I get older. So depriving her of that, even though she doesn't have a mitzvah, depriving her of that basic opportunity is grounds for dissolution of the marriage. So the Gemara says as follows: Fine. So the Gemara says weiter. Hamadir Amrav Kana, very interesting case. Hamadir is ishto. Shelo tishal, v'shelo tashil, nafa v'kava v'rechayim v'tanor. Yotzi v'ting suva. Shemasia, shem rabbi shchenosas. Well, it's an interesting case. Let's say a man makes a neder, and he tells his wife as follows: I'm making a neder. You are not permitted to go ahead and borrow any utensils from our neighbors, nor can you lend anyone, nafa, kavra, v'rechayim, a sifter, a sieve, or a grinding stone, or an oven. So in all of these cases, if he makes this neder, the halacha is yotze v'itein ksuva. He has to divorce her, give her a ksuva. Why? Because Rabbi say he's going to make her have a bad reputation by the neighbors. Part of neighborly relations is a willingness to lend stuff, right? And in return, borrow stuff, right? So if you're the kind of person, when the neighbor knocks on your door, says, "Could I have a cup of sugar?" Right? And you say, "No." Right? No, right? So that just spoils your entire reputation, right? So therefore, again, I will say, so again, this falls into the same theme that if the husband asks the wife to do things or makes a neder, requiring her to do certain things that are going to just fundamentally undermine her reputation, it's not a sustainable marriage. And in those cases, therefore, Yotzi v'itein ksuva. Shil Gemara goes out to Tainam Yachi Hamadris Isha Shal Tishal V'Shal Tashal Nafa V'Kaver Rechaim V'Tanor Yotzi v'itein ksuva. So similar idea, both have rights that supports this. A man makes a neder that his wife can't borrow, nor could she lend out. Nafa Kaber Rechaim Tanor Yotzi v'itein ksuva. He has to divorce her. Give her ksuva. Mipnei shemasiya shemra b'shchinosa, because he's going to make for a bad reputation amongst the neighbors. V'chein he shenadra shelo tishal v'shelo tashal nafa kaver rechaim v'tanor. So we'll say similarly, if she makes a neder that I'm not going to borrow anything, I'm not going to lend out the sifter, the sieve, the mill, the oven, v'shelo tarog begadim nan lebanav, or she makes a neder, I'm not going to make my children nice clothing. What's the halacha? Teitze shelo biksuva. The Rebbe say, here's the difference. See, when he's the one making this neder and imposing this upon her, there's an obligation to dissolve the marriage, and he's obligated to pay the ksuva. If she is the one making this type of neder, that undermines her reputation, and now she's also saying, I'm not going to make nice clothing for my children. In this case, he has a right to go ahead and divorce her, and doesn't have to pay the ksuva. Mipnei shemasiaso shemra b'shchinav. Ultimately, again, because she is creating, a bad name for herself with the neighbors. Good. That's the end of the sugya. Watch this Mishnah. Ve'elu yotzos shelo b'ksuva. So we'll say up until now, what we've been dealing with is what? Are situations where a neder triggers a divorce obligation. But remember again, who's making the nedarim up until now? It's the husband. The husband's making the neder, creates unfair circumstances which really prevent the normative marriage from progressing. So what do we say? Yotze v'itein ksuva. Then Rabbi say we're switching gears a little bit. Now we're switching to cases where divorce is mandated, but there is no ksuva. Here we go. Ve'elu yotzos shelo b'ksuva. So Rabbi say here are cases where if a woman exhibits certain behavior, ultimately a husband is obligated to divorce her, and there's no ksuva. Number one, ha'overes al das Moshe. So we'll say das Moshe is Torah. Torah. If a woman goes ahead and exhibits behavior that runs against, contrary to Torah law, that is grounds for divorce and loss of a ksuba. Or, ha'over al das Moshe v'Yehudis. Now we'll say das Yehudis is something incredible. What's das Yehudis? Look at Rashi. Das Yehudis. Shenag upenos Yisrael ve'afagav lo ksiva. Now we'll say das Yehudis means normative Jewish behavior. Now, what's normative Jewish behavior? So what's fascinating about this is this will be subjective. This will be subjective and will depend on community to community. In other words, certain communities have certain behaviors that are common behaviors in accordance with their Jewish practice. If a woman flouts these practices and decides ultimately again that she does not want to be bound by them, it ultimately again grounds for divorce and no ksuva. And here we go. Ve'ezi das Moshe. What's das Moshe? Machilaso she'ena mu'usar umishamash donida v'lo kotza lachala v'no deres ve'ena mekayim. So we'll say, what are some examples of a woman who goes ahead and violates biblical law? So some examples of it are, number one, ultimately again, she doesn't tithe the food that she gives the husband, right? She doesn't observe the halachos of taras hamishpacha. So ultimately, again, she's having relations with her husband while she's in nida. V'lo kotza lachala. She doesn't separate challah from the dough. V'no deres ve'ena mekayemes. She makes nedarim and she does not uphold those nedarim. So we'll say these are all examples of biblical law, what we call das Moshe. What's das Yehudis? So yotza v'rosha parua. A woman goes out with her hair uncovered. V'tava bashuk right? She weaves in the marketplace. Now again, we'll have to see exactly what that means. Umidaberes im kol adam, and she speaks with every single man. So we'll say, so you begin to see that the common theme amongst these things seems to be modesty, or in these cases, immodesty. Right? Immodesty. She's going out with uncovered hair. She's weaving in the marketplace. She speaks with all men. So again, this is what we call das Yehudis. Abba Shalom says, Af hamikaleles yoldov b'fanav. Interesting one. What's a violation of das Yehudis? A woman who curses her in-laws in front of her husband. It's a tough one. That's a tough one, right? So I'll say, so again, we'll talk about that more. So, right, so ultimately, a woman who curses her in-laws in front of her husband, right? Now, both like kolonis is a woman who raises her voice. So again, we'll define what this means. Ve'ezuhi kolonis. What does it mean a kolonis? It's a case ultimately where what? When she's speaking in her home, ultimately the neighbors can hear her. The neighbors can hear her. Okay, we'll discuss what exactly that's referring to as well. Let's look at the Gemara. So I'll just point out, by the way, we're going to get into this, but again, these categories of Das Moshe and Das Yehudis are quite amazing. So Das Moshe, again, biblical law. Das Yehudis, accepted normative Jewish standards. So let's go through this. Remember again, the examples of Das Moshe is, for example, where she's transgressing biblical law and causing her husband to transgress biblical law along with her. So where the first example was, she's feeding him food. She's feeding him food that is not tithed. So it says the Gemara, Hechidami. Well, what's the case? Idi yada, if he knows that it's not tithed, then what? Right? Idi yada, nifrosh. So don't eat it. Ida lo yada, mina yada. And if he doesn't know, how does he know? In other words, we'll say, what's the case over here? In other words, if he knows that it's not tithed, then he's not going to eat it. If he doesn't know that it's not tithed, then what? Sometimes what you don't know, you just don't know. So what's the case? To which the Gemara says, No, where she says to him, listen, she says to him, I will say in general, a person doesn't have to ask his wife, is dinner kosher tonight, right? You're not obligated to do that, right? So what's the case? The case is where she said to him, by the way, I took the produce to the Kohen, and the Kohen went ahead and tithed the produce for me. He sees the Kohen in shul. He says, Kohen, thank you so much for tithing the produce. And the Kohen says, which produce? Right? So it turns out that she lied to him. He finds out that she lied, that she did not tithe the produce. So we'll say in that case, it becomes clear that halacha l'maisa, she's violating biblical law. Mishamashto nida, and she has relations with him when she's a nida. So the Gemara says again, Hechidami, what's the case? Idi yadaba nifrosh. If he knows that she's a nida, then he should not have relations with her. Ida lo yada nismochiluya. If he does not know, we'll say ultimately again, a husband always depends on his wife when it comes to chusin. We'll say a husband has no obligation of independent corroboration of his wife's status. If a woman says that ultimately again she's not a nida, right? She's taking care of this. So halacha my husband has no obligation. After all, the Gemara says, Amar v'chinina bar kana Amar Shmuel minayin l'nida shesaferes liatzma. We'll say, from where do I know that a nida, she counts her days on her own? We'll say, husband has no obligation to oversee her nida process, right? Ultimately, she is in charge of that, and she could count for herself. She doesn't. How do I know that? So the Gemara says, listen to Shnei v'safra la shivas yamim la liatzma. Pasuk says she shall count 7 days. She shall count for herself. In other words, it tells us the count is for her. The husband has no obligation to oversee that count. Shabbos says, so if that's the case, so what's the case of where they're transgressing Hilchos Nida? To which Gemara says, Lo tzricha da amrale ploni chacham tir li es adam. So I'll say, what's the case? The case is where she said, I had a shaila, right, on a badika cloth, or I had a shaila, and I asked so-and-so Rav, right? The husband happens to see that Rav, and he says, thank you so much for taking care of our Taras HaMishpacha shailas. The Rav says, who are you? Right? Who are you? Right? So it turns out that she lied. And ultimately it turned out that she lied. Okay. So we'll say the Gemara goes back. The other possibility is we're talking about a case of a woman who is hochsaka that she is a nida. Now, we'll say, what does it mean she's established that she's a nida in her neighbor? Look at Rashi. Shira'uha loveshas big day nidos ulabayla amra tahora ani v'shimsha. So I will say, we saw this before, that it was customary often for women to wear different clothing during their yemei nidos, when she was a nida. So therefore, the case over here, she was wearing her nida clothing, so to speak, but she tells her husband that, no, I just forgot to change my clothing, I'm really tahora. And it turns out they have relations, and it turns out that she lied, that she was really a nida. So I will say, these are all examples, ultimately, again, of das Moshe, right? Das Moshe. Situations where ultimately, again, she is in violation of biblical law. V'lo kotza lachala. Similarly, again, she doesn't separate achala. Hechidami, what's the case? Idiyada nifrosh. So if he knows ultimately, again, that challah hasn't been separated, then separate it. Separate it yourself, right? Or separate from the food. Ida lo yada min hayada. And if you don't know, you don't know. Lotzicha da amrele ploni gabal tikin liyasaisa. Same thing I will say. She says to her husband, oh, you know, the baker went ahead, he took care of the dough for me. Va'azl shaili, and again, the husband bumps into the baker. Thank you so much for taking care of the dough. Va'ash, he says, who are you? V'ishtachach shechra. And it turns out ultimately again that she was lying. So I will say, all cases where the woman is willfully violating biblical law and lying about it to her husband. Lying about it to her husband. So I will say, there's no marriage like this. There's no marriage, which is an interesting thing I will say. In other words, you could have a marriage of spouses on different religious levels. You could have a marriage like that, where there is a sense of mutual respect and some level of collaboration. That could work. The problem that's happening over here in this case is there's two different levels of religious observance, and there's lying about it. And the problem is the lying about it undermines the husband's observance as well. So the Gemara says there's no marriage in a case like this. You can't, in general, by the way, it's not just in religion. You could have spouses in different spaces, right? You could in different places in life. You can have it as long as there is a spirit of collaboration and mutual respect. In this case, when she's lying to her husband about religion, not going to work. It's not going to work. Next case, no daras ve'in mekayim. Well, this is an interesting one. So if she makes nidarim and she does not uphold those nidarim, ultimately grounds for divorce. And no ksuva, we'll say, no ksuva. So Gemara says, why is that? Damar Mar, this is incredible. Ba'avo nidarim, banim mesim. Because we'll say, ultimately, again, for the sin of making nidarim and not fulfilling your darim, chas v'shalom, a person's children pass away. Shnei amar, al titin es picha lachti es bisarecha. Do not allow your mouth, lachti bisarecha, to cause your flesh to sin. And I will say ultimately again, what are the ultimate peros, right? The ultimate creations of one's hand. Havi Omer zebanav ubenosav. This refers ultimately again to one's children. So I will say, so lashav hikesias benechem. So I will say the pasuk says, for nothing I have stricken down your children. Lashav, what does it mean lashav? Al iske shav. Ultimately, again, because you did not uphold your word, right? Because you allowed your word, your nadarim, to be taken in vain, ultimately your children are lost. Tanya Harimer Omer, Shabbosai, Kalayodea Beishto Shenoderes Ve'ina Mekayames. Shabbosai, by the way, I'll just point out, it's pretty amazing, the intensity. So the Gemara literally says over here, if a person makes nadarim and does not uphold their nadarim, Chas v'sham Rachmano L'Islam Lo Aleinu, children die because of this avera. So Shabbosai, I'll tell you something amazing. In the Sefer Gurari, the Maharal says something absolutely amazing. The Maharal says, what's the pshat with this? In other words, what's the correlation between not fulfilling nidarim and that resulting in the loss of children? So the Maharal says something. Well, listen to this quote. He says, "Ki adibor hayotzi min ha'adam nechshav toldos ha'adam." My words are my offspring, right? I birth my words into this world. Therefore, he says, Lachein, kashem mechalal diburo. So therefore, I will say, if the verbal offspring that I birth into this world never take form, so I promise I'm going to do something, I make commitments I'm going to do something, and the birth, it's almost like it becomes a nafel, right? I birth words into this world. Words are great, but now I birth the words. The words only have kiyum. The words are only sustained if what? If they're followed up by action. But if the words are just words, and ultimately, again, they never turn into action, then it's almost as if what? My words have been miscarried, right? I miscarry my dibur. The dibur miscarried. The pregnancy ends, right? The words are birth, but ultimately, again, the actions are what allow the birth to be sustained. So the Gemara says it's a reciprocal punishment, right? It's reciprocal punishment. In other words, so my words were miscarried, so to speak, never turned into action. Rahman al-Litzlan, a person loses their children for that same aver. I will say it's a profound idea and tells us how careful we have to be that when you birth words into this world, make sure that those birthed words turn into action. Make sure those words are not miscarried. Chas v'shalom. Such an incredible yesod. Plus, I think there's also another piece to it, which is as follows: Ba'avo nidarim banim mesim. So we'll say sometimes banim mesim doesn't have to literally mean children die, but rather, what does it mean? What does it mean? It means that their growth is stunted. Their growth is stunted. I will say sometimes the worst parental mistake we make is we don't carry through on the commitments we make to our children. I will say whether that's simple commitments like promises to be home or promises to be somewhere or promises to do something, and we don't come through, it creates that sense of disillusionment, and it can create a certain sense, chasrum, of even abandonment. But even on a more global level, I will say, one of the most important lessons that we could teach our children is ultimately follow through. Follow through. You make a commitment to something in life, follow through on it. You promise to be somewhere, you promise to do something, you promise to accomplish something, you promise to go ahead and you have some life goal, dream, or aspiration, follow through. Because if my children see me, and I'm the kind of guy who talks a lot, and makes a lot of promises and a lot of commitments, but does not follow through on that, ba'avon nidarim banim mesim. I am stunting the growth of my children, and I'm teaching them to follow my example, be the same kind of adult who makes commitments but doesn't follow through on those commitments. To lead by that type of example is ultimately, again, stunting my children's growth, causing misa in a certain sense. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, Tanya Remeir Omer, we'll say second wide line, any man who knows that his wife makes nedarim and doesn't uphold those nedarim. I will say this is a very scary thing. So now we've seen that the penalty for making nedarim and not following through is quite intense. So what if a husband knows, Reuven knows that Rachel is always making nedarim and not following through? So what should he do? Yachzor v'yadirena. He should go ahead and make another neder for her, right? Cause her to make her neder again. What? Yadirena b'mai. So the yimadir b'mai metakin la. How does getting her to make more nedarim help her out? Ella, we'll say, watch this. This is incredible. Yachzor v'yaknitena kadei shetidar b'fanav v'yafer. So we'll say, this is very interesting. So what should he do? So apparently in this case, right, Rachel makes nedarim when she's upset or different. So he should provoke her. Now we'll say, again, many times the Gemara offers us good advice, right? Don't provoke. Don't never provoke. We'll say, so the Gemara says, so provoke her, let her make nedarim in his presence. Now we'll say, what's the godless of her making nedarim in his presence? What's the godless? If he hears about it, he can nullify it. Now, don't tell her you nullified it, right? Let her think that she made nedarim. But at least when you heard it, you know that you nullified it. So at least the halachic severity has been removed. Amrulo, he said to Rabbi Meir, it's not a life. Ein adam dar im nachash b'kfifa. So I will say, this is a Talmudic expression, you can't live with a snake in a basket. In other words, that I will say, as much as it's nice to say snake, you stay on that side of the basket, I'll stay on my side of the basket, Shalom Yisrael. In other words, I will say, you can't live in a state of unpredictability, which is such an incredible yesod. In other words, that you can't build a life with, I will say this goes both ways. Again, here we're talking about a wife who is an adronis, but the same applies to the man as well, right? Lamaisi, you can't live life in the basket with a snake. In order to build a relationship, there has to be some level of stability, some level of predictability. But again, if there's this constant state of unpredictability, what is it, right? Because the snake might go here, might go there, can't live like that. I will say, any man who knows that his wife does not remove challah from the dough. In other words, let's say, I will say, she doesn't remove challah, she doesn't take trumas and maestris. It's okay, it's not a big deal. What should you do? So the Gemara says, Yachzor v'yifro shachareh. So you do it. You do it after she gives you the dough, after she gives you the challah, you remove a piece of challah, you remove some shumas and maestros. Amrlo, ein adab dar nachash bikfifa. You can't live with a snake in a basket. So the Gemara says, well, meaning what? Meaning what? Did halacha l'maisra say, again, for a marriage to work, there has to be some level of stability, predictability, and mutual respect. Right? If at the end of the day, you constantly have to do these things that the other spouse is not doing. It's not going to work. So the Gemara says, "Man demasni la'aho kol shekin ahach." The one who said Abosai about the first case certainly says about the second. Man demasni ahach aval, but in the case of challah, zimnin demikri v'achal. The case of challah is a bit more complicated. Why is the case of challah a bit more complicated? Because the person is always eating bread. Right? So if every single time I have to remember to separate a challah, again, chances are one time I'm going to forget. So both say, so really just, you see, by the way, I just want to point out, so the Mishnah is saying, a woman doesn't separate a challah, a woman's constantly making the darim, ultimately, again, that's grounds for divorce without a ksuva. You can't live like that. You have these other opinions that are saying, no, find a way to navigate, right? Provoke her make nadarim in your presence, and then ultimately annul them. Or you separate the challah from the dough, to which the Gemara says, you don't understand. When a husband and wife are not on the same page about certain pivotal things, like nidarim, like halacha, like religion, there's no marriage. Now again, Abosai, like I said before, could a couple create a marriage when they're not on the same page, even about nidarim, or even about religion? And the answer is yes. As long as what? There's a mutual respect and sense of collaboration. You could build a happy, healthy marriage with two people who are on really different pages about a lot of different things in life, as long as, again, there is a spirit of respect and collaboration. If it's not there, so the Gemara is saying over here, if husband's going to be sneaking challah, I don't mean sneaking challah like eating challah, I mean sneaking like taking challah when his wife's out. You can't have a marriage like that. Or he's going to have to provoke her to make nidar. Doesn't work. It just doesn't work. That's not a marriage. That's not a life. That's not a partnership. So the Gemara goes weiter. So ve'ezi das Yehudis. Rabbi says, now let's transition. Das Yehudis. Rabbi say, what was das? So that was all up till now. That was all das Moshe, biblical law. What's das Yehudis? Ve'ezi das Yehudis. Yotzav Rosh HaParos. So we'll say an example of das Yehudis is apparently hair covering. Right? The woman goes out with uncovered hair. That's a violation of das Yehudis. Says the Gemara, Rosh HaParua. Covering hair is not das Yehudis, right? The woman going out with uncovered hair, is a biblical violation. Doraisi dichsiv upara es rosh ha'isha. I will say it's fascinating. Where do we learn out that there is an obligation for a married woman to cover her hair? Where does this come from? So I will say, fascinatingly enough, there's no mitzvahs asay that a married woman has to cover her hair. Instead, what is there? Ultimately, again, there is a din of sota. And the din of sota comes along and says that she is obligated, we uncover her hair. The fact that we're uncovering the hair of the isha sota indicates to us that halacha lamaisa, a married woman has her hair covered. The Tana will say, why the Torah seeks to go ahead and teach us about the obligation of hair covering, ultimately from such a situation, isn't interesting, but not for now. So we'll tell you the Be'er Yisrael. So Azhar Lebno Soshalo Yetzu B'Paro Rosh Daraisa. So we'll say this teaches us that halacha l'maisa, there is a biblical obligation for a woman to cover her hair. So we'll say if a woman goes out with uncovered hair, this is not a violation of das Yehudis. This is a violation of das Moshe. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara Amud Bezer will say, Kolsa Shapir Dami. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says this. Will say, so I'm sorry. Kolsa Shapir Dami. So we'll listen to this. Kalsa is a basket. If a woman wears a basket on her head, and I will say, what type of basket? This was dafka, a head basket. Look at Rashi. Tap Rashi and Beis and Beis. Sol sheyesh lo milamata beis kibul lo holama barosho beis kibul milamala lo seis bo plach bepishtan. So this is interesting. So apparently, this basket had, right, you wore it on your head, and it had a receptacle on top. What did you put on the receptacle on top? Your stuff, your keys, your cell phone, your wallet, right? In other words, again, the Talmudic equivalent, right? Your needle, your thread, your this, your that. You put your stuff on top. So I will say, so ultimately, again, here's what's interesting. Das Moshe, which is the Doraisa, Das Moshe, a woman has to cover, Midoraisa, a woman has an obligation to cover her hair. But Midoraisa, the basket is enough. Das Yehudis, have Rabbi say, Das Yehudis means what? So we'll say Das Yehudis is, but when it comes to normative accepted behaviors, afilu kolsa nami asar. A basket is not enough of a head covering. So Rabbi say this is incredible. So midda oraisa. So if you think about it, by the way, what does the basket allow for? So first of all, if it's a basket, it also means it has some slats. So maybe you can see some of the hair through the slats. It might also be that some of her hair hangs down. So Rabbi say midda oraisa, a head covering that allows for some hair visibility is going to be mutter. Das Yehudis says that no, a basket is not enough of a covering. She needs something that covers more. Now, Bosai, what's interesting about this discussion is no one's telling us how much, right? All I'm being told is Das Moshe Midda Oraisa, the basket is enough. Das Yehudis requires a more intense or more involved hair covering. So the Gemara says, I'm Rabbi Yasi, I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Kalsa, ein ba mishum parorosh. So ultimately, Rabbi says, name Rabbi Yochanan, the basket, if she wears the basket, that's enough to say that her hair is covered. In other words, if she goes out with the basket, that's not tantamount to going out with uncovered hair. Habiba Rabbi Zera, Hecha. What do you mean? We just said before that's not true. We just said before that the basket works for Das Moshe, but the basket doesn't work for Das Yehudis. So where is she going out? Where is she going out? Ilema B'shuk. If she's going out into the marketplace, Das Yehudisi. Shabbos say ultimately again, if she's going out into the shuk, then Das Yehudis, right? Das Yehudis requires that what? She goes out with a more significant covering than the basket. The Ela b'chatzer. Maybe it's in her own chatzer. In her chatzer, so you're telling me that a woman has to cover her hair in her own home? Imkain lo henachta bas li Avram Avinu she'yosheves tachas baila. If that's the case, Rabbi say, essentially, you've allowed no daughter of Avram to remain with her husband. In other words, Rabbi say, we always take it for granted that a woman doesn't have to cover her hair in her own home. Right? So now you're telling me what? The kalsa is enough in her own home, in her own chatzar? To which the Gemara says, very interesting. We mean when she goes from one chatzar to another chatzar in the same mavra. Remember again from our Eruvin days? Remember how domiciles was set up. You had multiple homes that opened up into a shared courtyard, right? Multiple courtyards that opened up into a shared mavui, an alleyway. So what are we talking about? If she wants to go from one chatzar to another chatzar, right, through a mavui, in that case, she's kind of going in public, but not fully going in public. Maybe, so again, in that case, Rav Asi says that ultimately it's enough for her to wear her basket. Okay, Shabbosai. So I just want to point out, this sugya, we are definitely not doing it justice today, because this is such an important sugya in contemporary halacha. But here is what we have. Das Moshe, da'oraisa, a woman is obligated to go ahead and cover her hair. It appears that based on Das Moshe, what does she need to fulfill that obligation? What does she need? Kalsa, the basket. What does that mean exactly? Here's what I know it means. I know that it means not a complete hair covering, right? Some type of covering that maybe doesn't cover everything. Comes along Das Yehudis, and Das Yehudis says, no. A Jewish woman needs, just Jewish women benoeg to cover their hair in a more, we'll call it, expansive fashion, a more complete fashion. But again, what don't I know? I still don't know what that means, right? How much more covering? What is being covered? Is there any part that could be left uncovered? So again, we're actually not finished. This sugya is going to come up again, but here's what we know. That for either violation of Das Moshe or Das Yehudis, ultimately that's grounds for divorce without a ksuva. Incredible. But another example, if she speaks with all men, I skipped. Vitava b'shuk, she weaves in the marketplace. So we'll say, what does that mean? So it's talking about a case where we'll say, this goes back to the Choma story, right? Remember again that what happens when she's weaving, sometimes her dress rolls up and you could see her arms. In other words, seeing her arms in a way that was not normally, so we'll say, we live in such a highly sexualized society. See your arms? See your arms? It's like a G movie. What do you mean, see your arms? Like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? Shabbos says, so just understand, obviously this is reflecting a different mode of tznius. That a woman used to keep her arms covered. So if she's weaving in the marketplace, and I guess she's lifting her arms, her arms become uncovered, that was considered to be a breach of modesty standards. This is the Gemara Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says, "Betava verad kineged paneh." Rabbi say, what does it mean? She's weaving in the marketplace, and ultimately, again, she's weaving in a way where she's sitting with her legs spread apart. Now she's clothed, but she's sitting with her legs spread apart, and the spindle is between her legs. So the idea is that she's sitting in a way that draws attention to her in an immodest fashion. And ultimately she speaks with all men. She's flirting with young men. Amra Rav Bar Chana, Zimna Chada, Rav Bar Chana told the story. Zimna Chada Havaka Isla Basrei de Rav Ukva. One time I was walking behind Rav Ukva. Chazisi Lahi Arabia. We saw there was an Arab woman, and she was going ahead and weaving in the shuk, and ultimately, again, the spindle was opposite. Her legs were spread apart, again clothed, but her spindle was between the legs. Kevan de Chazasina, when she saw us coming, psik de lepilcha, she broke the spindle, shadise, and she threw it. Or she was trying to engage them. Amrali, she said to me, Ulam, havli plach, young man, do me a favor and fetch me my spindle. Amar Bar Ukva Milsa. Rav Ukva said, this is exactly what the Mishnah was talking about. My Amar Ba, Ravina Amar Tava B'Shuk. So Ravina said, so according to the one approach, Ravina said that Rav Ukva said this was a case of a woman weaving in the marketplace. So the Gemara said, Rabbana Amri Midaberes Im Kol Adam Amar Ba. No, this was a case of a woman who speaks with all men. All right, so we'll have to stop over here for today. But Lamaisa, again, we end off again with this incredible sugya. So again, these are all considered to be breaches in modesty. And because they're considered to be public breaches in modesty, therefore what? They're grounds for divorce, ultimately again forfeiture of the ksuva. To be continued, Rabosai, shkoyach. All right, Chevra on Zoom, have a great day and a good Shabbos, everyone. Wonderful to see everyone. Great day, Jen. Thank you. Good Shabbos. That's good.